A very warm good afternoon to you. Sri S. Ramasamy Naidu Memorial College, Department of English, in collaboration with University Malaya, Malaysia, Faculty of Languages and Linguistics, Arts and Sciences, organizes an international faculty development program on a pedagogical shift from text to hypertext, language and literature to the digital natives. Jubilantly, we stepped up into the third day of today's program. Now I request Dr. Sangeeta, Head Department of English Language, Faculty of Languages and Linguistics, University of Malaya, to welcome the gathering. Ma'am, please deliver the welcome address.
Thank you, Dr. Sudha. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Vanakkam. I'm Dr. Sangeeta, and I have the privilege to introduce our two lovely speakers for today. Our first speaker, Dr. Kok Siew May, completed her Master's in English Language and Literature in Oxford University and her PhD in University Malaya. She specializes in Renaissance drama and teaches Shakespeare, as well as introductory courses to literature to students at the English department at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, University Malaya. She is also co-editing an online database of Shakespeare performances for young people as part of the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive hosted by the National University of Singapore. So for those interested, we have an expert on Shakespeare here. Our second speaker, Dr. Regina Yung Yu Jen, is a former Fulbright scholar and graduated with a PhD in literary history from Ohio University. She has been teaching for around 10 years, both in Malaysia and the United States. Her area of interest is in 19th century depictions of women's lives, religions, and race. Her recent scholarly publications include a book chapter entitled "The Health of the Eye Seems to Demand a Horizon," a comparative analysis of Emerson's nature and self-reliance with Douglas's narrative. Her creative short stories and poetry have appeared in New York-based literary journals. She currently teaches writing and literature courses at University Malaya. We have a writer amidst us here. I'm sure all of you are eagerly waiting to engage with our speakers. Over to you, Dr. Siew May and Dr. Regina. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sangeeta. I'm going to pass the time over to Dr. Regina Yung because she'll be taking the first part of this session. Then I'll step in and I'll be interacting a bit more with the rest of you in the second hour. So Regina, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kok. Let me go ahead and share our slides on a Zoom chat. So this is a link to our slides, and we'll have a couple of interactive activities. So feel free to just follow along there. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen first. Okay. There we go. All right, so Vanakkam, Salam Sejahtera, and a very good evening to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I found like Dr. Charity, Dr. Chiu's presentation on Monday really insightful, and even Dr. Bharat's keynote yesterday to be really beneficial. And I hope all of you felt the same way as well. My colleague, Dr. Kok, and I will be presenting on our experiences teaching poetry and drama in an online setting. So I'll begin by talking about poetry first, and followed by Dr. Kok, who will focus more on drama. Okay, so I'd like to begin today by talking about the end. So to begin with the end in mind means to start with a very clear understanding on your destination, where you're going. You need to know what direction to go, what to include in the journey, so that every step that you take is always in the right direction. right? At the start of the pandemic, we were all forced into this online classroom. And many of my students who came to class were like, oh, thank you for creating a sort of structure in class that we know, okay, this is when we learn, what we learn. And structure is so important, especially in designing our learning activities and even our assessment. So for today's presentation, I use this model called the backward design model. And contrary to what the name suggests, it's actually quite a modern and recent approach to teaching. So some of the benefits that of backward design teaching includes that when you start the class with learning outcomes, students are more inclined to follow along and know where they're going. So they won't get lost in all the factual details or all the little activities that cause them to ask, wait, well, what's this for? Why are we doing this again? Because they know, like, okay, the end goal is to learn a certain concept or a certain literary technique. The second advantage is that this sort of backward design instruction is more, it gives the student an overall gain of what you're gonna learn. Okay, at the end of the day, I can learn this very tangible outcome. And so students are more like celebratory, like, oh yay, I learned how to critically think about tone and mood in a poem. Or maybe I learned more about characterization in literature. Okay, so like tangible goals, overall gains in a classroom. So this backward design process is really, well, it was started by Higgins and Matai. And to simplify what it really means is just this thing called where to. When you're thinking about your learning activities, you're thinking about your lesson plan, think about where do you want your lesson to go to. So they break it down. The W means just be clear on where the unit is going and why. H is for allow for content that can hook and hold the students. In an online classroom, I barely see any of my student faces. You're not really sure if they're there or they're watching Netflix or messaging their friends on WhatsApp. So like creating a hook or starting with a question or something really interesting would be like, oh, okay, students will want to learn and stay and to find out more. E is for equip students for performances. I'll be talking through how to facilitate a breakout room discussion so that students know, okay, this is how I should be responding to questions or different activities in a classroom. R is allow students to rethink and revise. So I'll talk about the peer review process and why editing, writing, rewriting is so important, and students should not be feeling discouraged and like, oh, it's such a, I'm a failure in life or things like that, but really encouraging them to rethink and revise. A big part of just the writing process. E is allow opportunity for students to self-evaluate and even reflect on learning. I talk about how we have weekly blog posts and how to get students to interact with one another and even just keep track of their interaction, just so people are not just responding, oh yeah, good, or well done, right? A more engaging and meaningful conversation through that reflection. T is tailor learning to a variety of needs, learning style, and feedback. This one is a little trickier because think about if you have a classroom of 15, 20, 30, it's hard to really cater to different needs. And then the last one is organize the flow of your design, the flow of your classroom teaching. All right, so this is the where to backward design framework. Let's move on to the next. So I created a learning outcome for my presentation today. So two things. The first one is to apply a backward design process to online learning activities. So for example, from your check-in activity to breakout room discussions to online peer reviews, how can we apply thinking about the end, thinking about the outcome from the very start, right? The second one is to utilize various digital platforms to teach poetry. I remember Dr. Barrett's survey yesterday said that all of you enjoy using Google Classroom, and we'll talk about how to even use different ways to talk about peer reviews or even teaching literature. Okay, so I'll be talking about a variety of, say, synchronous classroom activities, face-to-face, what we do in the classroom, and even asynchronous, what you do outside when class is over, to just retain teaching. All right. So I'm drawing from my experiences teaching in a literature classroom in San Francisco. The college is called Make School. I was teaching there from August 2020 to July 2021, really in the thick of the pandemic. So it's really a small college targeted for underrepresented and lower income communities in the field of technology around San Francisco and the Bay Area. My students range mainly from 18 years old to 25, and all of them were pursuing a degree in applied computer science. So you see, like, even though I'm teaching poetry, I try to link it with computer science, software engineering, coding, right? So the course I taught was part of the Science and Letters general education program for all college students. And it's a mix of synchronous and asynchronous online learning. So Mixed School, this is like the Mixed School logo or motto, but just really helping lower income communities succeed in life. Okay, so when I was teaching at Mixed School, we use this messaging tool called Slack. It allows you to create your own channel. There's a main discussion board, if you see here. But if you want to create a separate thread, you could. And so it pops out at the side, just so it does not congest the main page. And although many of us may not use Slack, I understand, like, perhaps we're more used to WhatsApp. At least I know that's what we prefer at University Malaya. I think it's important to establish clear guidelines on online communication, just so important messages do not get lost in 100 messages you might receive in a day. So I'm very intentional in creating different platforms for communication in an online classroom. So our Slack channel served 3 purposes during COVID. So the first one is for important announcements. Second part is for check-in activities. And the third is for if students had any questions. And the truth is, students are always going to have questions. Some students may ask really smart questions and you want to engage with them. Some students may ask things that you actually just said 3 seconds ago. So to prevent them from bombarding me with private messages and at all sorts of odd hours, I give them a guide map to their questions. So I told them, if you have questions about assignments, teaching slides, always refer to your syllabus. Secondly, if you can't recall something I may have said in class or discussed, feel free to post on Slack and your friends can help enlighten you. Lastly, if there's a fire or you need to leave class immediately, or you're not sure if you're going to pass the class, you can reach out to me directly. This is just to channel them to, like, okay, here's where the information is available. You don't necessarily always need to just private message your professor if there's not a need. All right, so back to the check-in activity. So usually I have 3 goals when I talk about check-in activity or icebreakers, warm-up activity. 3 things I would like to establish is, 1 is to build a connection with students. Second is to check how much they actually know about the topic. So if I'm going to talk about poetry, what do they really understand about poetry? And the third part is just to introduce the topic of the day. So if you see the picture on the right, it says a quintain. It's a poem with 5 lines. So one of the check-in activity would be write a 5-line poem about your week, right? I'll give you 10 minutes and then people will respond. They will post on Slack. And I'll start asking questions about the different aspects of poetry. What makes a poem? I noticed here you rhyme in these 2 lines, and just really get students warming up to the form of poetry, and also just creating that interaction with classmates, right? And also one thing that I found important during a check-in activity is that I had students telling me, oh yeah, it's so awkward, all these icebreakers, I don't want to do it. But if you tell them that the end goal of your check-in activity is it's always something related to class, and that the check-in activity actually builds your skills to the topic of the day, students are just more open. Oh, okay, this is useful. I need to participate, and it's not just for fun or just killing time. Right? Students are more inclined to participate. All right, so yeah, so feel more inclined to participate, and they tell you about their life through poetry. Sometimes I do this thing called checks for understanding, and really you can do this like at the start of class, in the middle of class, or even at the end of class. I use this thing called sticky notes on Google Slides. So for example, this question is, what do we need to pay attention to when reading a poem? So if the previous class I talked about different aspects of poetry, I might want to start the class first with, okay, let's see what you remember. And if you click on this link, it actually leads you to more resource of different formative assessments that you can use for class, which I found really, really helpful. They're like, I think 20 or 30 strategies here. So go ahead and just click on the link and you can read more about it after the presentation, or you can use it whenever you like to in class. So it talks about hand signals, 1-minute essays, 3-minute pause, and getting your students to say, okay, I changed my attitude about, I related to, like, so different examples to use. I want to focus today on 3 things that I use often in class. The first one is, for poetry, a 1-word summary, right? A lot about poetry is the overall tone, the overall mood. And so I like to say, okay, just pick 1 word, or just pick 144 characters, like a tweet, right? Tweet your response to this poem, right? Just 1 word, very limited words, just so they understand what is the main idea or overall feeling from that poem. So 1-word summary is one of my favorites. You can see other examples here that are really helpful. The second one is, it's almost like a scale. So sometimes I have students telling me, oh, poetry is so tough. I'll never understand a single thing about poetry. Yeah, I have really dramatic students sometimes. So if they can't give you, say, a concrete answer, or they struggle with responses, then I give them a scale. Okay, do you think this poem is a poem about death or life, right? Strongly agree, disagree, agree slightly, right? And there you slowly sort of tease out how they're really experiencing the poem and giving them words to articulate. The last one that I'll talk about today is 1 question and 1 comment. So sometimes I get students who come to class and feel that they have to have the answers to everything. I'm like thinking, even I don't have the answers to everything. And you feel like you need to have, you need to know everything. So I tell them, come with a question. It's okay if you can't, or you feel that you can't say anything about the poem, come with a question, right? 1 question and 1 comment. And so sometimes in breakout room discussions, they're assigned to a poem, and then they create 1 question, 1 comment, and then it goes around in a, I want to say circle, but it's more from screen to screen. What do you have to say? How will you respond to your previous classmates' question? And so it's more of a collaboration. And I think that's really important in understanding poetry, right? The conversation becomes more in-depth with the opportunity for all students to learn a new perspective on the text. So always tell them what's the purpose of the activity, and then they're more inclined to open up. Okay, so that's checks for understanding. Let's move on to presentation. Oh yes. Okay, now I would like to ask like all of your experiences, a little bit about breakout rooms. But before that, if you could just head over to a slide. So I give you the link. I can go over and post a link here again. So choose an icon. So the icon on the right down here. And on this spectrum, so tell me, how have your breakout rooms been, right? Just put an icon. If it's on the right, it's really, really effective, or on the left, not effective at all, right? Your students are not sure why we're doing this. So I'll give you a few minutes and go ahead and drag that icon. And also, while you're doing that, think about what are some of the challenges or suggestions you have, right? What worked for you, or maybe what did not quite work. And so feel free to post it on Zoom chat, or even drag it along, drag the icon along here. I'll give you a few minutes. So it's on slide 8 off the chat. Maybe I should give you the direct slide. So slide 8 here. And for others, if you're not in the slide, you can talk about your challenges for breakout rooms, or some things that really, really work for you. Maybe you can like share it with everyone too. I'm gonna put mine somewhere here. So anyone about like how was online breakout discussion usually like? Some things that are really hard, some things that went really well. Maybe some difficulties dragging the icon. Okay, so I noticed quite a few people found it very effective. Maybe you can post on Zoom chat what makes a good discussion, or what are some secret techniques that you make sure that you guarantee a good discussion. Okay. Yes, Dr. Kalk posted a question on Zoom chat. What are the tricks, techniques you use to make sure your breakout room discussion work? Okay, I see some of you still dragging the icons, and maybe we can revert to the question in a little, but yeah, please feel free to respond on Zoom chat on some of your techniques. I would definitely love to hear what you're doing in class. But I can share personally what I do here. So for my creative writing class, and because they're all computer science students, I always start my classes or before of my first or second breakout room discussion of the semester. I talk about this article called Fostering Creativity in Discussion. So it's really how Pixar fosters creativity. And many of my students love Pixar movies. I start off with talking, what is your favorite Pixar movie? Which part did you cry at? And then everyone starts telling me the parts they cried at. And so we talk about how, like, to create a good movie or a good story or a good piece of writing, such as poetry or short stories, we need to create that sense of conducive environment that encourages creativity. So by talking about what Pixar does, and I give them a few minutes to read it, and I'll ask them to post 2 or 3 lines that really stood out for them. Right? And then we'll talk about how taking risks are important, making mistakes, not being afraid of failure, and just like talking about your ideas or your interpretation of poetry is really important. I found that far easier in my classroom in San Francisco. People were very vocal and more open to failure. I think the environment encourages that, especially in San Francisco, where there's like a startup and people are like, do what you want, individuality. I still remember when I was teaching poetry in Malaysia, my students will come up to me like, teacher, don't tell us what we think. Don't ask us questions about what we think about the poem. Just tell us what you think about the poem and we'll write that for our exam. I know. It's really about how you interpret it, and the exam is going to be an essay, and it's always about how you articulate your interpretation of the poem. So that was always a challenge of teaching poetry in Malaysia, especially. And so after we read this collective creativity, really the main thing is, there's this little quote here by Ed Catmull. He used to be the head of Pixar. To be a truly creative company, you must start things that might fail. And students, I think when I create a breakout room discussion or classroom discussion, I'm always telling them, it's a low stakes environment. It's your place to really just build your persuasive argument. If this is what you think about a text, explain it clearly and coherently. So I always tell them, this is low stakes environment. No one's gonna like laugh at you or make a big fuss. So that's what I really encourage for breakout room discussion, and make sure I frame it in that backward design model. The goal is to create your story similar to Pixar, and this is what we need to do to get to that collaboration of different ideas. Okay, so now I'll go to talk a little bit about facilitating a breakout room discussion. So for this activity in particular, I start off with, well, usually when I teach poetry, I'll read the poem aloud or get a volunteer to read it aloud. And then I'll ask what they noticed about the poem, what stood out, different aspects of the poem, post it on chat, unmute themselves. What are some of the feelings that pop up, and importantly is, how will you say it differently now? I think a lot about my creative writing in class for the software engineers were to see, how do you translate creative writing into different aspects of your life, especially in coding or in their careers, right? So I asked them, how will you say it differently right now? So for this particular breakout room discussion, the task was really rewrite a poem using computer engineering language, right? Using coding terms. My goal for them was for them to appreciate the poetic structure and also understand how tone and mood is created through different phrases or different words. So you see on the right, it's E.E. Cummings, I carry your heart with me, I carry it in. Right, that's his poem about love, loss, and longing, to say it simply. And so on the left, it's a breakout room discussion that 4 of them worked on using modern language to convey the same meaning of love, longing, loss, but using like Wi-Fi, right? So instead of I carry your heart, it becomes I carry your code with me. I carry it in my drive, like hard drive. And then it goes on, instead of no fate in the second stanza, no fate, no world, they change it to no Wi-Fi, no lag. For speedy, you are my connection, my true. And instead of the sun, they change it to a CPU that always transmit. That's you. And then it go on to talk about, it gets a little technical here, like .env. It's a coding that, how do I explain this? A coding that jumpstarts everything in their program, right? So process.env and all this different .avl tree. And so really just seeing them trying to understand the poem in a modern twist. Right, and ends the line, I carry your heart, I carry it in my heart. So I carry your code, I carry it in my drive. So really getting them to play structure, meaning, and also appreciating the poetic form. So breakout room discussions are really hit and miss. If you do it well with clear instructions and a little bit of coercion, it works out really well, at least personally for me. So what I do is first I give them instructions, I assign the breakout rooms, but I also assign breakout room leaders. So for Zoom, you can actually put like the name of the breakout room, and then on the side, I'll add the breakout room leaders, and I'll make sure to rotate it between different students. And I found that breakout room leaders are helpful because you suddenly have students who, it reinforces and creates a sense of accountability, like, okay, hey, let's get started. And sometimes when I jump into different breakout rooms, I notice that students are silent because, they forgot what they needed to do, or they are a little lost. So a leader is always helpful because they can remind and be more, take that sense of ownership of keeping the discussion going at least. But I make sure that everything does not just fall on the leaders. It's not just the leaders doing the work, because I'll get different people to present at the end. And so I think like for a breakout room discussion, how I always make sure that there must be a deliverable at the end of the discussion, or else they'd be like, okay, no one's going to know what we discussed about. So after the breakout room discussion, we reconvene and they present for 2 or 3 minutes on their finding, their poem, or once I told them to write a poem using only emojis, right? We were talking about nature poetry. And I said, okay, no words now, just use emojis to convey nature. So some people put a dark storm, different little emojis to convey that, which was really fascinating, really trying to get them to think about the text in different ways. Okay, so like I said, my students were computer science, software engineers, but I think it's always good to cater to different students. Maybe you're teaching a group of nursing students. One of my coworkers used to teach English to nursing students, and everything is more catered to disease, mental health, and so it's really up to you to create poetry that might be able to cater to the world of your students. Okay. So Jamboard, I know we've talked about Jamboard a lot. I really love using Jamboard. I see Jamboard as like endless numbers of whiteboards where it's for you to use and you don't need to clean it at the end of class, right? That's like a dream come true. I still remember needing to clean whiteboards after writing on them. I do not miss that. So what I do really for Jamboard, my main goal for using Jamboard is to understand big ideas in literature. So for example, if I introduce a plot diagram for telling a story in narrative poetry, I would want them to apply that diagram to maybe their life or student story. So I'll give you an example here. This is my students' work. Jamboard. So I think we were talking about the plot diagram, right? So exposition, complication, climax, reversal, resolution, denouement. So sometimes I'll try to apply it to a text, say, for example, narrative poem like The Raven, right? Or I'll make it less like text driven, but more of like, okay, let's just apply this concept to your life. So do you really understand like what's going on? And so I have on Jamboard, you can do all of this, right? It's not just text, but you can add pictures. So I have this student here that sees her life in this way. Expected to get a tech job, successful life, eventually lost everything or did not work out well. And so they're engaging with the literary framework and just to show me that they're engaging with the big idea. So I like using Jamboard for that because you can, write about it and put pictures too. I feel like you always get some cheeky students about, they'll do, okay, starting off their day quiz and then the denouement is eating donuts. You always get this like students who like to joke around for class. And sometimes I feel like that's fine, right? I want to give them that space. So as long as they're engaging with the plot diagram in different ways. So yes, this is how I use Jamboard and I'll be interested in hearing what you do with Jamboard as well. I think there's lots to be done there. Okay, so back here, let me click Prism. But like I was saying, Jamboard is not enough to really get them writing and thinking long and hard literature. So now I'll move on to more the assessment part of backward design learning. So I have a few pictures here. Is that creating a clear assignment structure online is very tricky because at least in class you can tell if your students are confused, you just repeat it again and then you might call and then, hey, do you understand? You look really confused. But online you don't get that. So creating a clear assignment structure is extra. I tend to over prepare or over tell than under tell. And so I have like two pictures here. One is giving clear instruction is a fine balance between what you say, what you mean, and also add what your students hear, and then the end students doing what you want. And so I'm not sure you played this game, telephone, where you pass on a message. I think I played that in high school or primary school, where you might say peas, they hear peas. At the end, it's passed on as sneeze, cheese. And by the end, like fifth or sixth person, they hear fleas. Right? So it's a common thing that people mishear. So writing out clear instruction, especially in an online classroom, I find is very helpful. So I'll give you an example of what I did for my poetry assignment. Okay. So this is assignment 1 called, Poetry and Technology. Really connecting the poetic form with their life of technology. So some questions, I started with the description. So for example, how would some poems change in the light of technology? What are some new technological imagery that might replace a metaphor in nature? Or if you could change the persona of the poem into an AI being, if like poems were written by algorithm, how would that change poetry? Right, so I try to get them thinking with all these different questions. They can choose to tackle each one of them. So I have the due date here, and I also put learning outcomes. What is the goal of this assignment, right? Creativity, clarity, persuasiveness, structure of poetry, hone skills and critical thinking analysis. I usually try to keep it between 3 and 4. So goals of this assignment so that they know what they're learning and what they're being in a way tested on. I give them also a schedule. Some people might think this is a little much, but I just give them a rough breakdown on, okay, what you might need to be doing. Most students just do everything on day 14 anyway, but I just found it helpful to give them a breakdown. So I'll tell them the requirements, what you need to do, and so this poem, this assignment requires you to rewrite a poem. Second part is analyze the poem, right? And then I give them the rubric of basically what they are required to do. So the class I was teaching was a pass-fail class, meaning it wasn't like A+, certain grade, B+, certain grade. It was just as long as they pass. So I'll tell them what are the requirements to actually pass the class, 4 points. If you get a perfect score, how do you do that, right? This, of course, is just a brief breakdown. I have like a more in-depth understanding of what are some writing requirements. Okay, I have no access to that anymore, but it's just really telling you about organization, coherence, grammar, and things like that. And I give them other resources, for example, our poetry teaching slides. We covered that in class, go back to look at it, it'd be helpful. So these are the different sections of my assignment. Just so if they have any questions, they can always, this is their source of truth. They can come back and know what's going on. Okay, so that is assignment. Another thing that I like to talk about too is, let's see. So writing, I like to encourage the writing process through digital archives. Some students think that when they do something, the first draft is the best draft and they're not going to do any changes at all. One archive I like to do is Emily Dickinson's archive, meaning like we have all her manuscripts of all the things that she wrote, like her poems that she wrote on like scraps of paper. I think like the main purpose of me showing manuscripts, and it's amazing because we all have it now in digital archive. You don't need to travel to different parts of the country to find that, is that writing is a very messy process. And great authors has drafts that are like really messy. Well, he has really nice handwriting, but just to encourage them, like we might see the end product as like, oh, Charles Dickens' book without grammar errors, perfect sentences, but it's not a true depiction of how writing actually works. So I like to show them different authors and how they started with the writing process. So this is just to encourage them like, hey, it's okay if you have a first draft and second draft, it's totally normal. So using digital archives to show them that great authors also had many bad drafts. Okie dokie. My computer is hanging for a bit. So yes, encouraging the writing process through different archives. I think this picture is actually the draft of Great Gatsby. And so yeah, lots of editing, which is part of the process. The next one, and I think like this is the last thing I would want to say about feedback is like, there's this term like keyboard warriors. Students who might not say those things in a face-to-face class, suddenly they're like, whoa, typing things that I'm like, wow, that's really mean, rude, and why would we say that, right? And sometimes in peer reviews, they might be like that, keyboard warriors. And the danger about sometimes being in an online classroom, you have students that might not be as respectful as you would have them be if it was a face-to-face classroom. So the first thing about peer review structure, oh yes, I make sure they send their writing to Grammarly. Grammarly is great because you just copy your work and then post it on Grammarly, and then they'll tell you what was right, what was wrong in terms of grammar, right, and sentence structure. And it's almost like having an editor look at your work, you know, before submitting it. So that's Grammarly. But to prevent this sort of like keyboard warriors and mean sort of like sort of ill-natured criticism, I always make sure that I use this peer review structure in the sense that it's not enough to tell students, hey, you need to give good feedback. Students sometimes do not know what good feedback looks like. And so I'll give her a template, usually the first few weeks of class, to make it in a form of a letter, because in a letter, it's more personable and you recognize that the person or a student that you're criticizing or critiquing is a person with a name. So here, I think, so this was, usually they'll use Google Document and they'll just like comment on the side. I think it's lagging a little bit. So they will just comment on the Google Doc. And so the structure is dear so-and-so, your poem is about, and then you add a 2-sentence summary. And so I think the first part is important is because it shows that students understand the meaning of the story, right? If you don't understand the story, then you can't really critique the story well. So I make sure that it starts off with, what's the story about? What I like about the poem is, and you can comment on character, persona, tone, mood, style, what you admire, what you really thought the author did well. And then the second part is what I had questions about. It's really like places to improve for the author, right? What I had questions about is maybe you were unclear about the structure, content, phrases, or plot. This is where you can ask questions to show the author that there are some things that maybe might need to be elaborated or added into the story or poem. Last part is author suggestions and encouragement, right? To keep the writing process going. And then it ends with, yours sincerely, whoever the author is. And I found like this sort of template actually encouraged students to be more open and engaging in an online setting. Another way too, what I do is that each week for their responses, if I find some feedback really insightful, really, I won't say heartfelt, but just you can tell the student really engaged with the work, I would also read it out in class, right? To just show students what is like a good model of responding or engaging in peer review. Okay, lastly, to conclude, if you forget about everything I've just said, really what I want to convey is that thinking about your classroom from the end outcomes is like giving students a signpost. This is Taman Supute. I live near there, and it tells the student where they're going, what they can achieve. And this framework for ACE is taken from the University of Minnesota. It talks at the very top is the aims, learning, and development, and how that actually shapes everything. Atmosphere, your learners, the assessments, the learning activities, breakout room discussion. And so my main message is really think about the end and cater learning activities and assessment according to what you want the learning outcome to be. So that's all from me. Thank you. I'll now pass it to Dr. Koch.
Great. Thanks very much, Dr. Regina. So I think what we can do is I have invited questions in the chat box, but no one has typed anything just yet. So while you're digesting all that material, and it's a lot of interesting ideas there, maybe this is a good time to take a 5-minute break. So what we can do is everybody take a 5-minute break. And in that 5 minutes, when you come back, I would like you to have with you a piece of blank paper and something to write with. So, a pen, a pencil, a crayon, whatever it is, okay? So take a 5-minute break, and when you come back, have a piece of blank paper and something to write with. All right, and also if you want to raise any questions, then feel free to keep typing them into the chat box while we take our break, and then we can address them once we come back. Right, thanks very much.
Dear participants, kindly not to quit. We'll start again at 3 o'clock. We'll take 10 minutes break. Please don't quit.
I don't know whether everybody's back from their break or not. And so what you can do to help me is, if you're back here, you could just put a thumbs up either in the chat box or under the reactions so that I know that you're back. Some of you may not be so familiar with the Zoom platform. I myself seldom use it for classes. So if you're searching for the things you need to do, if you just send your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you'll find a little toolbar at the bottom, and there you will get the chance to put in reactions. You'll see a little smiley happy face there, and there you get to choose an emoji, a thumbs up, a smile. If you really don't like what I'm saying, a really angry face, but please don't do that to me. You also there get to play around with the video filters. So, you know, whether it's for you or for your students in the future, usually when I start off my classes, I encourage my students to play around with the platform a little bit so that they know what they can do. Especially the idea of a video filter is very helpful for students who might be a bit ashamed of the space that they're in when they're studying. I've students who might be sitting in a bedroom with 5 other people with them, or a very messy, rundown sort of hostel. And so what you do is that if you go over to the video, there, if you just click on video, you will find that you can choose a virtual background, you can choose video filters, and that's something that's helpful for students as well as participants in a conference like this. Okay, so if you're back, then just give me a thumbs up. Otherwise, I shall assume that I am speaking to your cats and rabbits and all your other pets. Thank you, Sandhya. It's lovely to see your face. Okay, a couple of people are back. Great. Also, a reminder that you want to get hold of a piece of paper. So get a piece of blank paper. Doesn't have to be very big, but a piece of blank paper and something to write with. So a pen, a pencil, a marker, you know, a crayon if you have your preschooler next to you. Get something to write with, because we're going to be using that in a very short while. Okay, thanks. Vijay says they're back. Thank you very much. Others are probably still making their coffee. So we'll give them a couple of moments. All right, in the meantime, if you have any questions that you want to ask either Dr. Regina Yung or myself, feel free to use the chat box, and then we'll make sure that we come back to these questions at the end of the session. Okay, Anil is connecting to audio, so not quite here yet. Others look like they should be here, which is excellent. All right, so last call. If you're here and you haven't already, give me a thumbs up or a smiley face, or just turn on your camera for a couple of seconds. That'd be good too, so I know who exactly I'm speaking with, and you know, you get to say hi to me and not just me saying hi to you. All right, so just do something that tells me that you're back and I'm not speaking to the walls. Thanks, Tanya. Thanks, Dr. Manoj. Dr. Jacqueline, thank you very much. Hi, Sudha. Right, I'm going to say from the outset that I like calling names, but if I mispronounce your name or if I don't address you with your correct title, some of you may be professors, some very high positions that you may have in society, but that's not reflected in your Zoom nickname. So my apologies for that in advance. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I want you please to get hold of your pencil and your piece of paper. And I want you to have a look at this picture that I'm going to show you. Okay, not this one, this one. Right, so you should be able to see a picture with a sketch what I would like you to do is I want you to reproduce this sketch on your piece of paper. Okay, so on your piece of paper, reproduce this sketch. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but as long as you get the basic outline, that pear-shaped outline with the two brackets, something that looks like a nose and that little grid in the middle. That's excellent. So I'll give you about 10 seconds to do that. Okay, if you're done, give me a thumbs up in the chat box so I know that you're done and you're set to move on to the next thing. Just head over to the chat box and give me a thumbs up or a smiley face or something that tells me that you're done. Thanks. Great, thank you. Okay, so here is what we're going to do, okay? I want you to look at this picture and then I'm going to give you 2 minutes to turn this into a picture of a girl. All right, so let me say that again. You have the picture in front of you, you have your pen or pencil. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to turn this sketch into the picture of a girl. Okay, so you can do whatever you want, but you can't remove any of those parts that are already there. All right, so let's have 2 minutes beginning from, let's see if I can get my timer going. There we go. All right, 2 minutes from now. Ten more seconds. Okay, time's up. I apologize. I forgot to warn you that there will be music coming on. So I hope none of you got a shock when that suddenly blasted through your headphones. I hope you're done with your picture of your girl. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to ask you to very briefly turn on your camera so that we can all see your drawing. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now. And I want you very quickly just to turn on your camera so that I can see the drawing that you've done and the rest of us can as well. Okay, don't be shy. It's not an art competition. We're all teachers, we're not artists. So don't be embarrassed if your drawing doesn't quite look like something by the great artists. Thanks, Regina. Wow, nicely done. Dr. Manoj, I can see your keyboard. Ah, right. Thank you. Others, can I see your pictures, please? Just very quickly turn on your camera so I can see what you've done. Vijay Rekha, I'm waiting to see your picture. Thanks, Dr. Manoj. Others, Dr. Jacqueline. Dr. Gokula Krishnan, thank you. All right, thanks very much. Others, can you show us what you've done? Anyone else? Okay, now if this were my classroom, this is where I tell my students, I'm going to wait. Thanks, Sharma. Wow, that's an excellent large piece of paper. I like that. Nice. Arthi? Great, thank you. Last call, anybody wants to show us your masterpiece? None? Okay, that's all right. Now, I want to show you what can be done with that same picture that you just saw, okay? So again, if I can get my videos going. Have a look at this. Oops. Great, thanks very much. So many of you gave responses. You said it's amazing, it's wonderfully done. I think it's fantastic. And obviously this is done by someone who is an artist, right? Which, as I said, none of us are. But I like using this clip to talk to my students about the idea of creativity and adaptation. And when we think about adaptation, if, like me, you teach drama, then adaptation is a concept that we talk about quite often. We talk about how when you approach a play or a drama, especially something that is written a long time ago, such as something by Shakespeare, which is what I teach, initially people tended to focus on the idea of authenticity, that you want the performance of Shakespeare today to look exactly as it did when Shakespeare was alive. And so for a long time, performances were judged based on how authentic they were, how similar they were to the original. But there's been a shift in the way people deal with things like that. And today what we value is creativity. And so, for example, coming out of India, we have that fantastic trilogy, you know, Makbul and Haider. And those are actually adaptations of Hamlet and Macbeth. And they are being praised and lauded in the international circle, not because they look like the Shakespearean play, which was written 400 years ago, but because they have become very relevant today. The director has been able to take Shakespeare's material and to make it speak to today's issues and speak to the concerns of his country in particular. And so in the process, he has shown us his creativity, and that is what we appreciate. And that's important for us, I think, because when you come to the classroom, Regina and I were just saying yesterday that, sometimes being in a classroom is a bit like a performance. You go in and your students are there. And whether you think of yourself as being the star actor, or whether you think of yourself more as the director and they are the cast, you want to think about the idea of creativity. Because with this sudden shift to online learning, everything has changed. And so we no longer judge our teaching on how well we stick to what we always did. But this becomes a new process in which we appreciate how differently we can do things. And over the last 2 days, we've been introduced to many useful and exciting platforms. I got really excited when Dr. Charity showed us her escape room and things like book widgets, which I've never used. Of course, there are platforms that we are familiar with, things like Kahoot and Padlet. And then yesterday, when I saw Dr. Dilip with his Glassboard, that was just absolutely mind-blowing. But sometimes I think that we can get a little bit too fixated on the technology. And we think that the more platforms we use and the more we are able to play around with different platforms, the better it is. But in fact, creativity isn't so much about pulling in more things, it's about working with what you have. And so as teachers, and I suspect that many of you were teaching for many years before we had to suddenly shift things online, you already have certain skills and certain techniques that you are used to using in the classroom. And so the question is, how do I take what I already do and what I know works with my students? How do I take that and how do I now move it onto this new digital platform? Now, when we think about adaptation, it's also useful to think about how in adaptation, you try and transform your obstacles into opportunities. So for example, in that picture that I showed you, right? I remember the first time I had to do this exercise. And when I was told to turn that picture into a picture of a girl, my first question was, that awful thing with the spikes, what do I do with that? Do I turn it into braces? Do I make it look like one of those face masks? Because that was at the start of the pandemic. And the question is, what do you do with those obstacles? In the clip that I showed you, that person transformed that awful looking thing into something beautiful. It became something decorative for this girl that he's drawing. And so we want to think about how obstacles can become opportunities for us to teach better and to engage our students in a better way. I was paying attention to the chat box on Monday when Dr. Charity asked what kind of problems you all face when you have to teach online. And I was smiling to myself because the answers that came in were exactly the things I struggle with, right? Students don't want to respond, students don't want to turn on their cameras, you don't know if the student is there. And sometimes you ask a question and you call on the student's name and you just get silence. And you don't know whether it's a student who has gone to sleep or whether it is a student who is struggling with their internet connection. And so we want to think about how there are particular obstacles to students in terms of how much internet access they have, in terms of how many devices they have to use. Some students may have the luxury of a laptop as well as a smartphone. Some students may be sharing a laptop with 6 other siblings in the same household. And there are also obstacles for us as teachers. There may be lots of platforms out there, but some of us may struggle with technology. Some of us may enjoy technology, but it will just take a lot of time to learn this program and then learn how to use it for my class material, especially if I'm teaching a course that I've never taught before. And I end up having to study both the material I'm supposed to teach, as well as studying this technology that I'm supposed to use. So I want to think for the next few minutes about 2 particular obstacles that might arise. One is the idea of interaction, in which we very much miss that physical interaction, being able to see our students, read their body language, joke around in the classroom with them, and also to have our students just talk to each other when there are breaks. And the second problem is the problem of assessment. How exactly do you assess students when you can't, sit them all in the same exam hall for 2 hours and make them write an essay? So starting off with the idea of interaction, I tend to think that this problem with interaction is an opportunity for us to move the way we teach. So in the traditional lecture hall, what I do is that I walk into a classroom holding a copy of Hamlet or Macbeth or whatever it is I'm teaching in my hand. And I basically stand there and I talk to my students for 60 minutes. We stop to read parts of the play together. I stop to ask them questions. They ask me questions. But essentially, it's just me at the front of the classroom holding the text. And I'm teaching. I'm the one imparting the knowledge to them. And I think that having to move online becomes an avenue to encourage us to think about how we can move from teaching and being the gurus with all the wisdom to becoming facilitators, in which we are there to facilitate our students' engagement with the material. And eventually, we become explorers with them. And that's where things get really exciting and things get really fun. So have a look at this comic strip. When the pandemic broke out, what happened in Malaysia was that the universities were closed, childcare was closed, kindergartens were closed. So I was sharing a room, a study room, as it were, with my 6-year-old. And so in the morning, she has her kindergarten classes, and I have to be there with her because she didn't know how to use the laptop yet. And then thankfully, in the afternoon, when my classes came on, her classes were over. So it was fine. I could just teach, and she was somewhere else in the house. But what I found interesting was this difference, all right? In her class, all the kids were trying to talk at the same time, and they were running back and forth trying to show everybody, oh, look at my toy, look at my shoe, oh, look at what my sister did. And when it came to me, I couldn't get a single response out of my students. And sometimes I think that we tend to say, oh, well, kids are like that. Kids are very excitable. They're not so inhibited. Whereas teenagers and young adults have got more, social restrictions. They're more concerned. But I also think that sometimes the responsibility is on us, not to entertain these students, but to try and draw them out of the little spaces that they are in. And I want us to think about the way in which we impart information. Now, I know that when I started off online teaching, what I did was that I spent a lot of time recording lectures. And I was quite proud of myself because I could have slides running and my face was there, and I thought I was doing a fantastic job. But if you pay attention to the kind of platforms that our students are probably using, you realize that there is a limit to a person's attention span. So TikTok, for example, allows 60-second videos. They're now moving into a possibility of 3-minute videos, but that's not quite caught on yet. Twitter allows you to do 140 seconds. TEDx, their wonderful platform, it allows people to engage with ideas on a deeper sort of interactive level, but TEDx caps its videos at 18 minutes. And there's a reason behind each of these things, because the science that backs it tells us that people have a limit to how long they can engage deeply with what you are saying. And so research shows, for example, that if you're going to do an online class, what you want to do is, if you're going to be talking and imparting information, you want to do that talking for 10 minutes maximum. And then you need to go into an interactive activity. If you need to make it 15 minutes, don't go beyond that. Research on MOOC, those massive online courses, which many universities are now offering, many of these platforms essentially allow students to register for a course and they just assess the material and do it on their own time. And a lot of these courses are taught via recorded lectures. And what a research survey has done is that it has looked at the way in which participants assess those videos. And it showed that although most of the videos were about 9 minutes long, majority of the participants stopped watching at 6 minutes. And so it's quite heartbreaking if you think about the amount of time you spend creating this wonderful video for 20 minutes and your students stopped at 6 minutes, okay? The remainder just went down the drain. It makes us think about how we can't just keep talking. We can't just keep lecturing the way we would typically do in a physical classroom, because the platform is different, the attention span and the level of engagement is different. So what can we do? What I like to do is I like to work with asynchronous activities. So if a class is supposed to take up 3 hours a week, what I do is that I give them work before they come into the classroom, and that work should take up about 1 hour of their time. Now, these activities can start off with something that just makes sure that they have done their basic textual homework. So because I teach drama, before they can start discussing the play, they need to have read through the entire play. And so I might ask them to do a character map. So, you know, just give me all the characters. If you want to, you can hand draw it, or you can just write their names in labels and show me the connections. Or I might ask for a synopsis. So I want a synopsis of each scene, but I want each scene to be summarized in not more than 20 words. And I set a limit because otherwise students will be very happy to just copy and paste from SparkNotes, right? But if you say 20 words maximum, then they have to either generate their own synopsis, or even if they try and copy and paste, they at least have to read through the material while they are trying to reduce it to 20 words. Sometimes I ask them to come up with a storyboard. So in this one, I told them, okay, for this week, I only need you to have read Act 1 and Act 2. And I want you to give me a storyboard of what Act 1, Scene 1 would look like. And so they had to draw. And again, I tell them either use hand drawing, you can just draw stick figures, or you can use computer graphics, I don't mind. So what you have to do, I tell them, is that I want you to upload this material. Sometimes I use Padlet, sometimes I use Flipgrid. Occasionally, I use the Moodle platform or the MS Teams platform that the university uses for its teaching. And I tell them, I want you to upload these things before you come to class. So it makes sure that before they come to class, they have already started to engage with the material. Once we get into discussing a text and I want them to engage with deeper ideas, then what I do is that before they come to class, I assign them certain articles to read. But I make sure that these articles are short and the language is very accessible. Otherwise, students just feel overwhelmed and they give up. I also direct them to podcasts because many students prefer listening. And because it's drama, I like to use video clips, right? Because my basic philosophy is that drama or plays are meant to be performed. They're meant to be watched. If we miss a movie that came out in the cinema, we wait for the DVD release. We don't go and try to buy the script because it's not the same thing. So I like to get them to watch. If I can, I get them to watch the entire play. If I can't, and sometimes it's difficult because it's hard to find entire performances which are well performed and which are free of charge, then I just try and ask them to watch video clips, portions of the play. And this is a good resource if you're teaching Shakespeare, which I am. The RSC has a learning zone in which they have short video clips that perform key scenes. And so they'll take just one scene from a play, let's say Act 1, Scene 1 from Hamlet, and they get their actors to perform that scene maybe 3 or 4 different ways. And so if you just direct your student to that one particular clip, they can watch different ways of performing that one scene before they come into the class. And then once they come into the class, you can talk with them about it. Occasionally, what I do is that I gather my own collection of clips. So this is just a snapshot of my own platform that I was using a few semesters ago. When the students come into the week, they would have been able to click on any of those links. It would have brought them to a YouTube clip of 4 different productions of Macbeth. And so I asked them to watch these different versions. And then I tell them, come to class prepared to discuss the following. How are they similar or different? Which one did you like best and why? Which did you like least and why? And it's helpful before you give students video clips or even articles and podcasts to give them some questions so that they know what they're looking out for. And it helps them to begin to focus their thoughts. Once they come into the classroom, then what I like to do is, of course, I use breakout rooms. And so if you looked at the previous slide, you notice that there were discussion questions. Those discussion questions are questions which they will discuss with their classmates once they are in the classroom. I don't expect them to have answers to these questions before they come. So what I do is that when it's the asynchronous activities, I keep the questions quite simple. Again, it's just to ease them into the material so they don't feel intimidated. And then when they come into the actual classroom, they can deal with deeper content with their friends. I also use polls. So for example, building on what I showed you just now, when they came in, I asked them to respond to a poll. And Poll EV or Poll Everywhere is one of the platforms that I like to use. It's very much like Mentimeter, similar concept. So I get them to vote for which one they liked the most. Also, I get them to tell me perhaps in one word, what they think about the character. And so this becomes very useful if you're teaching drama to talk about characterization, to talk about particular scenes and the way in which the way in which one scene can be interpreted in different ways. I also like to play games, and that's very similar to what I just did with you, because the games have a way of just waking people up a little bit, I think, and livening things a little bit. One of the useful resources I like is Wheel of Names. I like it because, again, it's very simple. And so what you do if you go to wheelofnames.com is that they will give you this little box at the corner where you can key in whatever you want. So if I'm talking about themes in a play, for example, I will key in all the themes I might want to talk about. And then when the students come into the classroom, I say, okay, I'm going to click this, and then the wheel is going to spin. And as the wheel spins, wherever it stops, that's the theme that we are going to talk about. Or I'm going to break them up into groups, and I randomly assign the theme that each group is going to talk about by, again, spinning the wheel. And so I can use this also for characters. Perhaps I just enter the list of characters instead. Sometimes if I have a small class and they are not very forthcoming, I key in my students' names. And that really gets them nervous, okay? But that makes sure that they come to class prepared. Scavenger hunt. So this again is something that's very low technology, okay? So I give them a list of items and I say, okay, I'm going to give you 3 minutes starting from now, go and find these things. So something soft, something sharp, something red, something that symbolizes power. So after the 3 minutes, they come back and show us the objects that they have. And then of course, because the last one is power, they then use that object to start talking about why it might symbolize power and how that might connect back to the play that they're studying. Here is something else that I like to do more as a form of revision. Essentially what you have there is a very, very tiny excerpt of a much larger picture. So one of the productions they watched was this production of Macbeth. And what I do is that I just take that large picture, and when the class begins, I zoom into one part of that picture. And I ask them, can you guess what scene I'm looking at? If they can't, I zoom out so they get a bit more information, and I keep zooming out and I keep zooming out until they can guess which scene it is. And then that becomes a platform again to talk about that scene perhaps, or a particular interpretation of that scene. Again, if you're teaching Shakespeare, and I apologize, but this is what I'm working with. This is a useful site. It's called Shakespeed. And what it does is that it's freely available. You don't have to pay for anything. You can basically go in there, and for any of the plays listed there, there would be 9 different cards. And when you click on one of the cards, it could be something as basic as maybe an actor delivering the lines, or it could be something like a video clip of a pop song. And so that becomes a starting point for the class to talk about a connection between that pop song and the play, and why someone might have included that pop song into this stack of cards. Sometimes just to keep things moving, I get them to play games which may not link directly to the lesson, but it keeps them engaged. And if it keeps them engaged, then to me, that helps and that works. So if nobody wants to go first, or if 2 people start speaking at the same time, and that always happens on a platform, then I say, okay, we're going to play rock, paper, scissors. Okay, so the 2 people who started speaking at the same time, they both turn on their cameras and they just go rock, paper, scissors, and whoever wins gets to speak first. So it sounds silly, I know, but at least it just keeps things lively. Something else that I draw on is this very popular game show called Minute to Win It. And so it's a game show in which contestants are given 1 minute to complete very simple tasks. And sometimes I do this after maybe 20 minutes just to break the monotony. Sometimes I do it as a form of taking a break instead of just a 5-minute break where they can do whatever they want. Or sometimes I use it when they first come into the classroom. And so it can be something as simple as, okay, I want everybody to just grab a coin, and I want you to spin the coin and then stop it standing with 1 finger. Or, I want everybody to grab 2 pencils, and I want you to use those 2 pencils to type a word on the keyboard. And so whoever types the word first, they win. And so these are just very simple ideas which just help to liven things up, and they use very little technology, which is good if you are dealing with students who are struggling with bandwidth. what I like to do is that before the semester begins, I ask my students. Sometimes it's students whom I've met before, and that makes it much easier. So I just get a WhatsApp group of everybody together. Or sometimes if it's students I've not met before, then I get a mailing list and I just create a survey on Google Docs. And I ask them, okay, do you have issues with internet connection? Do you have issues with a device? What kind of device are you using? And things like that just help me know what to deal with. And so if there are students who have issues with the internet connection, then I try to keep things as low tech as possible. I also ask them if they have any other concerns that I might need to know about, because I had one semester when I was using the breakout rooms a lot, and many students kept thanking me for that because they really miss being able to talk with their friends. And so they really appreciated being able to interact with one another. But at the end of the class, when I gave them an exit survey to gauge how well they were enjoying the platforms I was using, one student told me that she actually has social anxiety issues. And for her, having to come to the lecture and having to speak and discuss at every single class was just too much to handle. And so she said she had to log off a couple of times because emotionally she just couldn't cope with it. So these are things which we just want to be a bit aware of. And we learn how to work with the limitations that we are given. I think another part of teaching that is crucial as a literature teacher is the idea of close reading, right? And so sometimes I don't want them to go into breakout rooms because when they do that, they tend to rely on one another. The weaker students just wait for the stronger students to give the answers. Or when we come back for a debriefing, it's just that one student who was chosen as the representative. That one student who speaks is the one student who has any of the answers. So what I do is that I give them close reading when they come to the classroom. And I try to keep it very simple. For many of my students, Shakespeare is very intimidating because the language is archaic. They don't understand what it says. So I say, okay, everybody, we're just going to look at this passage for the next 7 minutes. And I tell them, no dictionaries. I don't want you looking on Wikipedia. I just want you to look at the screen. And I give them ample scaffolding. So I ask them very simple questions. I indicate the exact lines in which they're going to find the answers. And then after we've done that, we discuss the answers together. And then I move on to another passage. So it's basically the same passage broken down into different sections with ample scaffolding. And the point of this is really just to build up their confidence so that they know that they actually can understand the text by themselves. And eventually, these very simple reading activities end up building towards larger questions. I then get to talk to them about the issues that the play is addressing, and I get them to talk about how these things might relate to themselves. Now, here's the question I want to ask you. What do you do when your students are silent? So come on over to the chat box and tell me what you do when your students are silent. When you call and you call and you call and nobody volunteers an answer. What do you do then? Anybody? You say something funny? Okay, thanks. Yep, I do that sometimes. Try to draw them out. Thanks, Sharma. How do you draw them out? What exactly do you do? Go ahead and use the chat box. So if you prefer, just unmute yourself and speak. That might be easier. Whatever you prefer. Asking if they are still there. Okay. What else do you do? Engage fun activities. Okay, so maybe you switch into something else. Thanks, Shama. I know what you mean. I tend to backpedal. So I'm like, oh, okay, sorry, maybe that was difficult. And then I lower it to a simpler question. Okay, a positive remark. Thanks. That's right. I think, especially in a time when a lot of students are stuck at home, they do need quite a bit of affirmation. Ask them a few questions. Okay, presumably, Dr. Jacqueline, that means that they have a range of choices. Okay, thanks, Regina. That's a way to strike terror in the hearts of some students. Now, what I often do, I think it's very similar to what you are saying that you do, right? We tend to either drop the level because we think that maybe the students are intimidated. And so we try and give simpler questions. Sometimes what I do is I end up answering the question myself. Let me tell you something interesting that happened during this whole pandemic. Now, you already know that I've got a 6-year-old. I have 3 children who are 6 years and younger. And because my husband and I are both teachers, we don't allow them to watch much television. We much prefer them to be reading a book. But because it's the pandemic and we're all stuck at home, we actually started to allow them to watch some Disney. And this is something that we found interesting. One of the things that the children started to watch was Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. And in Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, each episode is very short. It's about 10 to 20 minutes. And it's often an adventure, right? So something has gone wrong. Donald has disappeared and Mickey has to go and find him. And what we discovered was that there's about 5% of that 20-minute episode which is spent in silence. In other words, the cartoon character actually pauses and waits for the child to respond. In this picture you have here, Mickey Mouse says, look, I can make a heart with my fingers. Can you do it? And then he pauses and he waits. And when our children first started watching this, because they're not used to watching television, initially they weren't sure what to do because they don't usually interact with talking mice. But because of that silence, they realized they were supposed to respond. And so they started to respond. And I'm ashamed to say that they've been watching much more Disney than ever before. But what we've realized is that this is a trend that carries through a lot of the television shows that the children are watching these days. A lot of them, whether it's a simple thing like a Mickey Mouse Clubhouse or something a bit more complicated, there's another series in which it's a mystery. Winnie the Pooh actually tries to solve mysteries. And the character turns to the viewer, as it were, and says, well, what do you think? Or what should we do? And they wait. And because they wait, the child responds. Now, what do you learn from something like this? Well, first of all, being teachers ourselves, my husband and I very quickly started to research when Mickey Mouse Clubhouse came about. And we discovered that it came about at the time when our students, our university students, would have been children. So chances are some of our university students would have been watching things like this when they were kids. The second thing we realized is that there is a sense in which you can set expectations for your viewers or for your students. And so in something like Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, within the first 3 minutes, there will be at least one point at which the character pauses and waits for the child to respond. And that happens very early in the episode because that sets the tone for the rest of the episode. Once the child understands that, then for the rest of the episode, the child is going to be responding. Whenever there's a pause, the child knows they are supposed to respond. And so I think it's important for us to kind of set guidelines for our students. On one hand, we need to be very sympathetic to the fact that they are struggling with perhaps social issues, perhaps emotional issues like the student I was telling you about. Perhaps technology can be a problem, but we also need to be there sometimes to kind of put a bit of pressure on them. A bit of pressure can be good, right? And so sometimes when you have silence, you just wait. And I quite like doing that. I tell my students, I can wait. And I wait. And at some point when the silence becomes unbearable, someone is going to speak up. Okay, so now and then, don't jump in too soon. Now and then, just wait. Next question I want to ask you. When we talk about assessments now, what is the biggest challenge you face in assessing students? What is the biggest challenge you face in assessing students? Again, either just unmute yourself, tell me what you think, or hop over to the chat box and tell me what challenges you face. What is the biggest challenge you face in assessing students? Anyone? You know by now, I can wait. So what are the biggest challenges you face in trying to assess students? They're bent upon not speaking, okay. So you're trying, but they're just completely shut off. Anyone else? Okay, it's difficult to manage deadlines, to enforce them because everyone is talking about how it's such a difficult time. Yep, I appreciate that. Anyone having problems trying to crack plagiarism? No, I think that similar to how we think about obstacles in interaction becoming opportunities, you can think about how obstacles in assessment can again become opportunities, right? So when interaction becomes a challenge for teaching, it's been fantastic to be able to force the students to deal with outside resources. I personally have no problem asking them to watch videos and articles which have been produced by other people, especially when it's something like Shakespeare and it's common knowledge, lots of people are there. So I don't feel the responsibility to produce things which are already produced. I'm there to facilitate their learning and to explore with them on this journey. When it comes to assessment, I think it becomes an opportunity for us to start assessing different skills in our students and to encourage them to develop those skills as well. So if you think, for example, about how traditionally, at least in where I am, traditionally students will sit for a final exam where they sit down and write an essay or 2 essays for 2 hours. And they're being tested on just actual knowledge, right? What happens in the play? What happens to the character? What does this say about certain themes? These are things which they already know. But we're living in a world where knowledge really isn't the problem, right? Because whenever you don't know anything, you just go to Google or you just go to Wikipedia, God forbid. But knowledge now isn't the real skill that they need to have. The skill they need to have is to be able to manage that flow of information that's available out there, and then to be able to innovate and for them to become content creators themselves. And so what I like to do is I like to deal again with performances. I might get them to record a performance or to design a performance. So here, for example, I have a group of students who were asked to perform a scene from The Merchant of Venice. And I told them, go ahead and use Google Meet, Zoom, anything you want, but I want this scene. And what you find is that they were able to put together a backdrop so that that one character who's on the balcony is actually up there on the balcony. And you do have a sense of space, even though they're all actually in their own homes. And I got this idea from a group that came up with live performances of every single Shakespeare play during the pandemic shutdown. And so here they are doing their version of The Merchant of Venice. And they were able to do one character throwing down a bag of coins on the other, even though they're actually in their own homes. Okay, so they were able to kind of create this illusion. Sometimes I ask them to come up with an adaptation. So here I've got my students performing the 3 witches in Macbeth, and they were asked to try and localize it. So they had to think about what the local equivalent of the 3 witches are. And what we're doing here is that we're really pushing them to higher ordered thinking. First, they will need to understand the play and to understand what the witches in Macbeth are and where they stand in society. And then they have to think about what the equivalent is in our local culture. So they're really being pushed first to have the information and then to use that information and to apply it to themselves. In this one, I asked them not to perform the play, but to design costumes for Twelfth Night. And so this group decided to present a localized version of Twelfth Night. And they did a very impressive presentation where it looked a lot like one of these style magazines. and they had all the different items that the character would be wearing with a write-up of each item and the symbolism behind that kind of fashion or that kind of color. This group decided to go with a very Bollywood theme. And so Olivia, this is her wedding dress, apparently. And again, they go into quite a bit of detail into colors and the symbolism of that. Again, this is students being pushed to think first of the knowledge they already have of the characters and the kind of emotions that they are facing, the social status that they have, and then to try and relate that to a different world. So what they're doing is they're having to gain information about different social contexts and to think about the relevance of the two. I've also asked them to do performance reviews. And so I asked them to watch a particular performance and then to critique it. And what I like to do is I like to do a combination of both group assessments, group work, as well as individual work. Because to be fair, you need to assess them individually in order to sense where they are. But at a time like this, when they're really struggling with the sense of isolation, it helps them to have some group work. They may hate it initially, but eventually, at least it forces them to interact with other people. So I give them performances, I give them certain links, I tell them to watch the performance, and then as a group, write a review about a particular character and the way that character is performed, or about the way certain issues are highlighted in that performance. I've also started to use this idea of an iSearch paper. It's not a new concept, it was there since the 1980s, but it's something that I've only just recently begun to adopt. So the iSearch paper is an iSearch paper, as opposed to your normal research paper. In the iSearch paper, the focus is on the I. And so what a student does is that, again, lots of scaffolding is necessary. So I start them off in the middle of the semester. I tell them that I'm going to ask them to just brainstorm. And so they need to brainstorm about possible topics that they want to write about. I give them certain boundaries. For example, if I'm teaching a paper about global Shakespeare, the way Shakespeare is performed in the world, I ask them to think about something they want to write about with regards to Shakespeare in Malaysia. And so I tell them I'm going to give them a 10% weightage for the brainstorming process. Now, it's a problem because once you know that you're being graded, it's hard to come up with ideas, right? And the pressure is there. So I tell them, okay, for the brainstorm process, as long as you do your work and you complete all those things I asked you to do on time, I'm going to give you the full 10 marks. And so they brainstorm for 10 marks. And then they are asked to present these ideas to a little group of their friends. And within that group, they will talk about which ideas are better or not so good. And then about 6 weeks later, I asked them to submit the first paragraph of that paper. And in the first paragraph, I expect them to explain to me what the question is that they're asking, how they hope to answer it, and why they think it's important. And then finally, at the end of the semester, I asked them to submit the entire paper. And the emphasis here is that I'm not looking so much for answers, I'm looking for a journey, their process of searching and discovery. And I want them to give me original findings. So I've had some really interesting things where students have looked at their favorite manga series or their favorite Netflix series, and they've picked out references to Shakespeare in them, and they've done analysis of that. Or I've had students who decided to go and interview their grandparents, uncles, aunts, parents, and to find out how much that generation knows about Shakespeare. So it's ended up being a very exciting thing because the students get to do something outside of just referring to secondary material. They get to do something that they are interested in and they are passionate in. And for me, I get to read something interesting rather than having to mark, 80 or 60 essays all on the same topic, all telling me exactly what I told them. So the iSearch paper has been something really exciting for me as well. I'm just going to end with this. These are a list of resources that you could use if you're looking at Shakespeare. All of these are FOC, and I find them really useful. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen sharing, and I'm going to ask if any of you have any questions. Very aware that I've broken my own rule of not speaking nonstop for so long. Any questions, any responses to what I've said? How many of you actually teach drama? Because I know we have a mixture here of English teachers who might be teaching language rather than literature. How many of you are actually teaching drama? Could you just, give me a thumbs up or A show of hands, so I know that you can identify what I'm doing. Ambarasi says she is, thanks. Sandhya, thank you. Yeah, Gayatri, great. Okay. I really think that for us to, thanks, Dr. Imtiaz, is it possible in large classes we have in India? I completely acknowledge that a large class is a very different ballgame altogether, right? And so some of the games that I play with my students, if I have a class of maybe 30 or 40 students, it's fine. But if I'm dealing with a class of 150 or 200, it's not really realistic. Some of them I think can still work. So what you do is you say, today, I'm going to target the people whose names begin with R. And then that's it. That's just one way of grabbing one chunk of the audience, even if you can't get everybody. I like very much group work. I think that helps them to forge relationships with each other. And that's, again, a way to make things manageable, even though you've got a very large group, right? So that you get to deal with different blocks of students. Any questions, any suggestions? Because I'd love to find out what you're doing as well. Any questions for Dr. Regina? Regina, anything to add?
No, I think like that was really great, and I love like the engagement in the chat box. So
Yep, thanks everyone for being responsive. That helps. Right, if there are no questions, then thanks very much for your time, and I'll pass the time back to the chairperson.
I think, dear resource persons, there isn't any questions. So can I go ahead with the formal vote of thanks?
Thank you so much.
With your permission. Thank you.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kokchumi, Senior Lecturer, Department of English, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, University Malaya. Thank you, Dr. Regina Young, Senior Lecturer, Department of English, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, University Malaya, Malaysia. Dear resource persons, your presentation definitely assists the teachers to find effective ways in teaching poetry and drama. It also enhances our 4 C's, that is critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication. Thank you once again. Thank you very much for suggesting and advising synchronous, asynchronous activities. Really, it is a mind-blowing, informative session. Thank you once again. Dear participants, we have flashed the feedback form in the chat box. Kindly fill it. Again, we'll meet tomorrow at 1:45 p.m. Indian time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Persons. Thank you.
thank you so much.
Dear participants, feedback form is in the chat box. Kindly fill it.
Thank you,
Again,
everyone.
we'll meet tomorrow at 1:45. Thank you, Dr. Sangeeta ma'am. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome, Dr. Sudha.
Thank you.